Captain Marcus Rodriguez gripped the controls of his Black Hawk helicopter as the radio crackled with urgent voices. The desert landscape below stretched endlessly, broken only by rocky hills and ancient villages. It was supposed to be a routine patrol mission over the Afghanistan border region, but nothing about this day felt routine. The morning had started like any other at Forward Operating Base Eagle. Rodriguez had checked his aircraft thoroughly, running through the pre-flight checklist with his crew chief, Sergeant Tommy Walsh. The helicopter's twin engines hummed with mechanical precision, and the rotor blades cut through the thin mountain air with familiar rhythm. Rodriguez had been flying Blackhawks for 8 years, and he trusted his instincts more than any manual. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, was newer to the squadron but sharp as a razor. She had graduated top of her flight school class and possessed the kind of calm demeanor that made her invaluable during high-stress situations. The crew chief, Walsh, was a veteran with 15 years of experience maintaining and operating helicopter systems. In the back, Corpsman Jake Morrison carried medical supplies, always ready to treat wounded soldiers. The initial mission briefing seemed straightforward. Intelligence reports indicated minimal enemy activity in their assigned patrol sector. They were to conduct aerial reconnaissance, check on a remote outpost, and return to base before the afternoon heat became unbearable. The temperature was already climbing toward 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and flying in such conditions required extra caution. As they flew over the rugged terrain, Rodriguez noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Black smoke was rising from a valley about 15 miles northeast of their position. It was too much smoke for a cooking fire or normal village activity. Through his headset, he heard radio chatter from other aircraft reporting contact with enemy forces. Chen pointed toward the smoke column and shouted over the engine noise, asking if they should investigate. Rodriguez knew they were supposed to stick to their assigned route, but his instincts told him something was seriously wrong. He had seen enough combat to recognize the signs of a major firefight. The radio suddenly erupted with desperate voices. Multiple units were calling for immediate air support and medical evacuation. Rodriguez heard fragments of panicked transmissions, mentioning heavy casualties, surrounded positions, and urgent need for extraction. The voices belonged to soldiers who were clearly in serious trouble. Walsh, monitoring the radio frequencies, turned to Rodriguez with a grim expression. He had heard enough battlefield communications to know when things were going badly. The smoke in the distance was growing thicker and darker, suggesting the fighting was intensifying rather than dying down. Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following his original flight plan, he banked the helicopter toward the smoke. Chen looked at him questioningly, knowing they were deviating from orders. But Rodriguez had been in combat long enough to know that when soldiers were in trouble, protocol sometimes had to take second place to saving lives. As they approached the area, the radio traffic became clearer and more alarming. A full company of infantry soldiers, nearly 150 men, had been conducting a sweep operation when they walked into a carefully planned ambush. The enemy had waited until the soldiers were spread out in the valley before opening fire from multiple directions. The terrain worked against the trapped soldiers. They were caught in open ground with little cover, while enemy fighters occupied elevated positions in the surrounding hills. Machine gun fire and rocket-propelled grenades were raining down on the American positions. Several soldiers were already wounded and unable to move to safety. Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from the hilltops as they drew closer. Tracer rounds were streaking across the valley like deadly fireworks. The soldiers below were pinned, down behind whatever cover they could find, mostly rocks and small depressions in the ground. Some had managed to reach a dried riverbed that offered minimal protection. Through his aviation headset, Rodriguez heard the ground commander's voice, strained with urgency and barely controlled panic. The officer was requesting immediate air support and medical evacuation for his wounded. Enemy fire was so intense that the soldiers could not move to establish a proper landing zone for helicopters. Chen checked their fuel levels and ammunition status. They had enough fuel for several more hours of flight time, but they were not heavily armed. The Black Hawk carried only door-mounted machine guns and a limited supply of ammunition. They were primarily configured for transport and medical evacuation, not close air support. Walsh scanned the battlefield below through binoculars, counting muzzle flashes and trying to estimate enemy strength. He could see at least a dozen enemy positions scattered across the hillsides. The enemy fighters had chosen their ambush site well, with multiple escape routes and overlapping fields of fire. Rodriguez knew that calling for additional air support would take time. Fighter jets and attack helicopters would need to be scrambled from distant bases, and by then it might be too late for the soldiers trapped below. The wounded needed immediate medical attention, and the entire unit needed extraction before enemy reinforcements arrived. Morrison, the corpsman, was already preparing medical supplies and checking his equipment. He could see through the helicopter's windows that several soldiers were lying motionless in the valley, either dead or seriously wounded. His medical training told him that prompt treatment could mean the difference between life and death for the casualties. The radio crackled again with an urgent transmission from the ground commander. Enemy fighters were moving to surround the trapped soldiers completely. Within the next hour, the American forces would be completely encircled with no chance of escape. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and conventional rescue procedures would not work in time. Rodriguez faced an impossible choice. His orders were to conduct reconnaissance and avoid engagement with enemy forces. His helicopter was not designed for combat rescue operations in heavily defended areas, but 150 American soldiers were trapped and facing annihilation unless someone acted immediately. Looking down at the desperate soldiers below, Rodriguez made the decision that would define his military career and possibly save or doom everyone aboard his aircraft. Rodriguez keyed his radio and made contact with the ground commander, Captain James Mitchell, who was directing the trapped soldiers from behind a boulder barely large enough to provide cover. Mitchell's voice was hoarse from shouting orders over the constant gunfire, and Rodriguez could hear bullets striking rocks near the captain's position. Mitchell quickly explained the situation. His company had been conducting a sweep operation to clear suspected enemy weapons caches when they walked into a well-prepared killing zone. The enemy had waited until the soldiers were spread across the valley floor before opening fire from concealed positions on three sides. Now his men were scattered across nearly a square mile of open terrain, with wounded soldiers in multiple locations. The captain's voice cracked with emotion as he reported his casualties. 17 soldiers were confirmed wounded, with at least 5 in critical condition who would die without immediate medical attention. 3 soldiers were already confirmed dead, cut down in the initial moments of the ambush. The rest of his men were pinned down and running low on ammunition. Rodriguez asked Mitchell about potential landing zones, but the news was grim. Every piece of flat ground large enough for a helicopter was covered by enemy machine guns. The few areas with adequate cover were too small or too rocky for a safe landing. Any helicopter attempting to land would immediately come under intense fire from multiple directions. Chen monitored the tactical radio frequencies, while Rodriguez talked with Mitchell. She could hear other units in the area reporting their status, but none were close enough to provide immediate assistance. The nearest friendly forces were at least 2 hours away by ground, and the terrain made rapid movement impossible. Air support from attack helicopters and fighter jets was being scrambled, but would not arrive for at least 45 minutes. Walsh studied the battlefield through his scope, identifying enemy positions and calculating angles of fire. He counted at least 15 muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills, indicating a well-coordinated enemy force of 30 to 40 fighters. The enemy had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible approach route. The enemy fighters were using a mixture of weapons including AK-47 rifles, machine guns, and rocket-propelled grenades. Walsh could see the distinctive smoke trails of RPGs being fired at the trapped soldiers. The enemy had also positioned snipers in elevated locations, making any movement across open ground extremely dangerous. Morrison prepared his medical equipment while listening to the radio traffic about wounded soldiers. He had treated combat casualties before, and knew that time was critical for trauma victims. Blood loss, shock, and infection could claim lives within hours if proper medical care was not provided. The soldiers needed more than basic first aid. They needed surgical intervention that was only available at the main base hospital. Rodriguez realized that conventional rescue procedures would not work in this situation. Standard protocol required securing the landing zone before attempting evacuation, but enemy fire made that impossible. He would need to improvise a rescue plan that had never been attempted before under such conditions. The pilot made contact with his base commander, Colonel Sarah Harrison, and requested permission to attempt a rescue operation. Harrison's response was immediate and unambiguous. Rodriguez was ordered to maintain a safe distance and wait for proper air support to arrive. Under no circumstances was he to risk his aircraft and crew by entering the combat zone. Rodriguez acknowledged the order but continued circling the battlefield, watching helplessly as enemy fire continued to rain down on the trapped soldiers. He could see soldiers dragging their wounded comrades to whatever cover they could find, but the limited protection was inadequate against the sustained enemy assault. Chen pointed to her fuel gauge and reminded Rodriguez that they would need to return to base soon if they were going to have adequate reserves for a safe landing. Every minute they spent circling the battlefield was using precious fuel that might be needed for an emergency situation. Through his headset, Rodriguez heard Mitchell's increasingly desperate calls for help. The captain reported that enemy fighters were moving closer to his positions, apparently preparing for a final assault. Several of his wounded soldiers were losing consciousness from blood loss, and his ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Walsh observed enemy movement through his binoculars and confirmed Mitchell's report. Groups of enemy fighters were working their way down the hillsides, using the terrain to conceal their approach. They appeared to be positioning themselves for a coordinated assault that would overrun the American positions within the next 30 minutes. Morrison watched through the helicopter windows as soldiers below attempted to treat their wounded comrades with limited medical supplies. He could see that several casualties needed immediate surgery to survive, and the crude battlefield first aid being administered was barely keeping them alive. The radio crackled with another transmission from Colonel Harrison, repeating her orders for Rodriguez to withdraw from the area immediately. She emphasized that losing a helicopter crew would not help the trapped soldiers, and would only make the situation worse. Her voice carried the authority of military command, but also the weight of knowing that 150 soldiers might die while following proper procedures. Rodriguez found himself facing the most difficult decision of his military career. His training, his orders, and military protocol all demanded that he withdraw and wait for proper support. But his conscience, his loyalty to fellow soldiers, and his assessment of the tactical situation told him that waiting meant watching good men die. Chen noticed that Rodriguez had stopped responding to the radio calls from base command. She could see the internal struggle playing out on his face as he weighed his options. As his co-pilot, she was duty-bound to support whatever decision he made, but she also understood the enormous personal and professional consequences he faced. Walsh checked his watch and calculated that enemy reinforcements could arrive within the hour. Intelligence reports suggested that additional enemy units were operating in the area, and the sound of sustained gunfire would likely attract them to the battle. If that happened, the trapped soldiers would face overwhelming odds with no hope of survival. The corpsman Morrison broke the tense silence in the helicopter by voicing what everyone was thinking. Those soldiers below were counting on them for rescue, and every minute of delay meant more casualties. He had taken an oath to preserve life, and that oath did not come with exceptions for dangerous circumstances. Rodriguez made his decision. He would defy direct orders from his commanding officer and attempt a rescue operation that military doctrine considered suicidal. He would risk his aircraft, his crew, and his career to save soldiers who would otherwise certainly die. The decision went against everything he had been taught about military discipline and chain of command, but it aligned perfectly with his deeper understanding of what it meant to be a soldier. Rodriguez turned to his crew and explained his decision in clear, direct terms. He was going to attempt an unauthorized rescue operation that violated direct orders and standard operating procedures. Any crew member who objected could request to be dropped off at a safe location, and Rodriguez would attempt the mission alone. No one would be forced to participate in what might be considered an act of military insubordination. Chen was the first to respond, stating firmly that she was staying with the mission. As co-pilot, her skills would be essential for coordinating the complex flying required to extract soldiers under fire. She had trained for exactly these kinds of emergency situations, even if the training scenarios had never been quite this desperate. Walsh immediately volunteered to remain as crew chief, pointing out that his experience with helicopter operations and weapon systems would be crucial for the mission's success. He had served with many of the soldiers trapped below, and was not about to abandon them when they needed help most. His knowledge of the aircraft's capabilities would be essential for pushing the helicopter beyond its normal operational limits. Morrison never hesitated in his commitment to the rescue mission. As a combat medic, his primary duty was to save lives regardless of the circumstances. He had medical supplies and skills that could mean the difference between life and death for the wounded soldiers below. His oath as a medical professional superseded any concerns about military protocol. With his crew united in their decision, Rodriguez began planning an improvised rescue operation, unlike anything attempted in conventional military doctrine. The challenge was extracting 150 soldiers from an active combat zone, without a secure landing area and while under continuous enemy fire from elevated positions. Rodriguez contacted Captain Mitchell on the ground and explained that they were going to attempt an evacuation despite the dangerous conditions. Mitchell was initially skeptical, pointing out that any helicopter entering the valley would immediately become the primary target for every enemy weapon in the area. The risk of losing the aircraft and crew was extremely high. The pilot acknowledged the risks but explained that waiting for conventional air support would likely result in the loss of most or all of the trapped soldiers. Enemy forces were already moving to surround the American positions, and wounded soldiers were dying from their injuries. An immediate evacuation attempt was the only chance for saving lives. Chen worked with Mitchell to identify the least dangerous approach route to the battlefield. They settled on a flight path that would take the helicopter behind a ridgeline before dropping into the valley at high speed. This would minimize the time the aircraft would be exposed to enemy fire, though it would still require flying directly through a combat zone. Walsh prepared the helicopter's defensive systems and checked the door-mounted machine guns. While the Black Hawk was not heavily armed, the machine guns could provide some suppressing fire against enemy positions. He also prepared smoke grenades that could be deployed to obscure the helicopter's approach and create temporary cover for the soldiers. Morrison organized his medical supplies to treat the most seriously wounded soldiers first. He identified which casualties would need immediate surgery and which could survive with basic trauma care during the flight back to base. His triage decisions would determine who lived and who died among the wounded. Rodriguez developed a plan that would require multiple trips into the combat zone. The helicopter could not carry all 150 soldiers in a single load, so they would need to prioritize the most seriously wounded for the first evacuation runs. Each trip would expose the aircraft to enemy fire and increase the risk of being shot down. The first phase of the operation would focus on extracting the 5 critically wounded soldiers who would die without immediate medical attention. These casualties were scattered across the battlefield in different locations, making the pickup extremely complex. The helicopter would need to land or hover at multiple sites while under fire. Chen calculated fuel consumption for multiple round trips between the battlefield and the base medical facility. They had enough fuel for approximately 4 trips, assuming normal flight conditions. However, combat flying used more fuel due to rapid maneuvering and high-power settings, which could reduce their operational time significantly. Walsh studied the enemy positions and identified which weapons posed the greatest threat to the helicopter. The rocket-propelled grenades were particularly dangerous because they could destroy the aircraft with a single hit. Machine gun fire could damage critical systems or injure crew members, while sniper fire could kill the pilots and cause an immediate crash. Morrison coordinated with the medical team at base to ensure that surgical facilities would be ready to receive multiple trauma casualties. The base hospital would need to prepare for the most serious combat injuries, including gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and blood loss requiring immediate transfusions. Rodriguez made a final radio call to Colonel Harrison, informing her of his intention to proceed with the rescue operation, despite her direct orders to withdraw. He accepted full responsibility for the decision and acknowledged that he was violating military protocol. His transmission was formal and professional, but carried the weight of a career-defining moment. The colonel's response was immediate and furious. She ordered Rodriguez to abort the mission and return to base immediately, threatening court-martial proceedings if he continued with the unauthorized operation. Her voice carried genuine concern for his safety as well as anger at his insubordination. Rodriguez acknowledged the order, but did not confirm compliance. Instead, he switched radio frequencies to communicate directly with the trapped soldiers, effectively cutting off further communication with his commanding officer. This action constituted a clear act of defiance that would have serious consequences regardless of the mission's outcome. Chen checked all aircraft systems one final time before entering the combat zone. Engine temperatures, hydraulic pressure, fuel levels, and electrical systems all showed normal readings. The helicopter was performing perfectly, which would be essential for the demanding flying ahead. Walsh loaded fresh ammunition into the door guns and positioned himself where he could provide covering fire during the evacuation. He also prepared flares and chaff that could be deployed if enemy forces used heat-seeking or radar-guided missiles against the helicopter. Morrison secured all medical equipment to prevent it from shifting during aggressive maneuvering. He also prepared stretchers and restraint systems for wounded soldiers who might be unconscious or unable to hold on during the flight. Rodriguez took a deep breath and pushed the helicopter into a steep descent toward the battlefield. The point of no return had been passed, and whatever happened next would determine the fate of everyone involved. The rescue operation was beginning, and there was no turning back. Rodriguez dropped the Black Hawk behind the ridgeline and accelerated toward the valley at maximum speed, staying low to avoid enemy detection for as long as possible. The helicopter's engines roared as he pushed them to their operational limits, knowing that speed and surprise were their only advantages against the overwhelming enemy firepower. Chen monitored the radio frequencies and coordinated with Captain Mitchell to identify the exact location of the most critically wounded soldiers. The first casualty was Sergeant Mike Thompson, who had taken shrapnel to his chest and was losing blood rapidly. He was lying behind a small rock outcropping about 200 meters from the main group of trapped soldiers. As soon as the helicopter crested the ridgeline and entered the valley, enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. Tracer rounds streaked past the aircraft like deadly fireworks, and the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to the helicopter filled the air. Walsh immediately returned fire with the door-mounted machine guns, aiming at the muzzle flashes on the hillsides. Rodriguez performed evasive maneuvers while trying to locate Sergeant Thompson's position. The helicopter pitched and rolled violently as the pilot avoided enemy fire, making it nearly impossible for the crew to spot individual soldiers on the ground. Chen used binoculars to scan the terrain while calling out potential landing sites. Morrison spotted Thompson's position and directed Rodriguez toward a small clearing near the wounded soldier. The area was partially protected by rocks but still exposed to enemy fire from at least two directions. Landing would put the helicopter in extreme danger, but hovering would make them an even better target for enemy gunners. Walsh continued firing at enemy positions, trying to suppress their fire long enough for the helicopter to land safely. His machine gun bursts were accurate and forced several enemy fighters to take cover, temporarily reducing the volume of fire directed at the aircraft. However, other enemy positions continued shooting, and bullet holes appeared in the helicopter's fuselage. Rodriguez brought the Black Hawk down in a controlled crash landing, knowing that a gentle touchdown was impossible under fire. The helicopter hit the ground hard, bouncing once before settling. The landing gear absorbed most of the impact, but everyone aboard was thrown against their restraints by the violent landing. Two soldiers immediately ran toward the helicopter, carrying Sergeant Thompson between them. The wounded soldier was unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple shrapnel wounds. Morrison jumped from the aircraft and helped load Thompson onto a stretcher, quickly assessing his injuries while bullets whined overhead. Chen kept the engines running at full power, while Rodriguez prepared for an immediate takeoff. Every second on the ground increased their vulnerability to enemy fire, and she could see muzzle flashes getting closer as enemy fighters adjusted their aim. The helicopter's rotor blades created a dust cloud that provided some concealment, but also made it harder to see approaching threats. Walsh provided covering fire while the wounded soldier was loaded, concentrating his fire on the nearest enemy positions. His accurate shooting forced the enemy gunners to keep their heads down, giving the rescue team precious seconds to complete the evacuation. However, he could see enemy fighters moving to new positions that would give them better angles of fire. Morrison worked frantically to stabilize Thompson's condition while the helicopter was still on the ground. The sergeant had lost significant blood and was going into shock, requiring immediate intervention to keep him alive. Morrison started an intravenous line and applied pressure bandages to the worst wounds. Enemy fire intensified as the enemy fighters realized what was happening. Rocket-propelled grenades began exploding near the helicopter, showering the aircraft with rocks and debris. One RPG round detonated less than 50 meters away, close enough to damage the helicopter's tail rotor with shrapnel. Rodriguez felt the aircraft shudder as shrapnel struck the tail section, and warning lights appeared on his instrument panel. The tail rotor was still functioning but showed signs of damage that could lead to failure at any moment. He knew they needed to get airborne immediately before suffering more serious damage. Chen called out that Thompson was secured and ready for transport. Rodriguez immediately pulled the helicopter into the air, climbing as rapidly as possible while performing evasive maneuvers to avoid enemy fire. The damaged tail rotor made the aircraft harder to control, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. As they climbed out of the valley, Walsh reported that the tail rotor was showing visible damage but was still operational. Several rotor blades had been nicked by shrapnel, and the control linkage showed signs of stress. The damage was serious enough to affect the helicopter's performance but not severe enough to prevent continued flight operations. Morrison worked on Thompson during the flight back to base, monitoring his vital signs and administering emergency medical treatment. The sergeant's blood pressure was dangerously low, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Morrison radioed ahead to the base medical team, providing detailed information about the injuries and required treatment. Rodriguez pushed the damaged helicopter to its maximum safe speed, knowing that every minute counted for the wounded soldier. The tail rotor vibration was getting worse, suggesting that the damage was progressive and could lead to catastrophic failure. They needed to reach the base medical facility before the aircraft became unflyable. Chen calculated that the round trip had used more fuel than expected, due to the high power settings required for combat flying. They had enough fuel for 3 more rescue trips, but each subsequent mission would have reduced safety margins. The damaged tail rotor also increased fuel consumption and reduced the aircraft's overall performance. As they approached the base, Morrison reported that Thompson's condition was stabilizing, but remained critical. The immediate medical intervention had probably saved his life, but he would need surgery within the next hour to survive. The rescue mission had been successful, but 149 soldiers were still trapped and waiting for evacuation. Rodriguez landed at the base medical facility and immediately began refueling procedures while Morrison transferred Thompson to the surgical team. The base medical personnel were shocked to see the bullet holes and shrapnel damage to the helicopter, realizing the extreme risks the crew had taken to save one soldier. Colonel Harrison was waiting at the landing pad, her face showing a mixture of anger and relief. She had monitored the radio traffic and knew that Rodriguez had successfully evacuated one casualty, but she was furious about his direct violation of orders. The confrontation was inevitable, but it would have to wait until the rescue mission was complete. Chen inspected the tail rotor damage while the helicopter was being refueled, confirming that the aircraft was still flyable, but operating well outside normal safety parameters. Each additional mission would increase the risk of mechanical failure, potentially resulting in the loss of the helicopter and crew. Walsh replenished his ammunition supplies and checked all weapon systems for damage. Several bullet holes had penetrated the aircraft's skin, but none had hit critical systems. The door guns were still operational, though the ammunition supply was significantly reduced from the first rescue mission. Rodriguez knew he had to make a decision about continuing the rescue operation with a damaged aircraft. The tail rotor could fail at any moment, and each trip into the combat zone increased the risk exponentially. But 149 soldiers were still trapped, and conventional air support had not yet arrived to help them. Colonel Harrison confronted Rodriguez as soon as he shut down the engines, demanding an immediate explanation for his violation of direct orders. Her anger was evident, but Rodriguez could also see concern in her eyes for the trapped soldiers and the risks his crew was taking. The colonel was caught between her duty to follow proper military protocol and her desire to save American lives. Rodriguez calmly explained that he was taking full responsibility for the unauthorized rescue operation and that his crew had volunteered to participate despite understanding the risks. He acknowledged that he was violating orders but argued that following protocol would result in the deaths of soldiers who could be saved with immediate action. The colonel pointed out that his damaged helicopter was now operating outside safety parameters and that continuing the mission could result in the loss of both the aircraft and crew. She had a responsibility to preserve military assets and personnel, and Rodriguez's actions were putting both at unnecessary risk. Chen interrupted the confrontation to report that Captain Mitchell was calling on the radio with urgent updates from the battlefield. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, with enemy forces moving closer to the trapped soldiers' positions. Several more soldiers had been wounded, and ammunition supplies were nearly exhausted. Walsh completed his inspection of the helicopter and reported that while the tail rotor damage was serious, the aircraft was still capable of flight operations. However, each additional mission would increase the stress on the damaged components and raise the probability of catastrophic failure during flight. Morrison emerged from the medical facility with updates on Sergeant Thompson's condition. The surgical team had successfully stabilized his injuries, and he was expected to survive. The rapid evacuation had made the difference between life and death, proving that the rescue mission was not only possible but essential for saving lives. Rodriguez requested permission to continue the rescue operation despite the aircraft damage and his earlier violation of orders. He argued that the successful evacuation of Thompson demonstrated that the mission was feasible, and that waiting for conventional air support would result in unnecessary casualties among the trapped soldiers. Colonel Harrison found herself facing an impossible decision. Military protocol demanded that she ground the damaged aircraft and court-martial Rodriguez for disobeying orders. However, she also knew that 149 soldiers were still trapped and that Rodriguez's helicopter was currently their only hope for survival. The radio crackled with another desperate transmission. From Captain Mitchell, enemy forces had completed their encirclement of the American positions and were preparing for a final assault. Without immediate evacuation or reinforcement, his soldiers would be overrun within the next 2 hours. The captain's voice carried the weight of impending defeat and the knowledge that his men were facing annihilation. Chen monitored other radio frequencies and reported that conventional air support was still at least 30 minutes away. Fighter jets and attack helicopters were en route, but the distance from their bases meant significant delays. Even when they arrived, establishing air superiority and securing landing zones would take additional time. Walsh checked weather conditions and noted that afternoon winds were picking up, making helicopter operations more dangerous. The combination of damaged equipment, hostile fire, and deteriorating weather conditions created a perfect storm of operational hazards that would challenge even the most experienced crews. Morrison prepared medical supplies for multiple casualties, knowing that the next evacuation runs would likely involve more seriously wounded soldiers. The base medical facility was also preparing to receive a large number of trauma patients, with surgical teams standing by for immediate operations. Rodriguez made his decision and informed Colonel Harrison that he was going to continue the rescue operation, regardless of the consequences to his military career. He had sworn an oath to protect fellow soldiers, and that oath took precedence over any concerns about personal punishment or aircraft damage. The colonel realized that she could not physically prevent Rodriguez from taking off, and that any further delays would only increase casualties among the trapped soldiers. She made the difficult decision to allow the mission to continue while making it clear that Rodriguez would face severe disciplinary action upon his return. Chen completed pre-flight checks on the damaged helicopter while Rodriguez planned the second rescue mission. The next priority was evacuating the remaining critically wounded soldiers before attempting to extract the larger groups of uninjured personnel. Time was running out as enemy forces prepared for their final assault. Walsh loaded fresh ammunition and prepared additional smoke grenades for the next mission. The enemy would be expecting another rescue attempt and would have adjusted their positions to better target the helicopter. The element of surprise was gone, making each subsequent mission more dangerous than the last. Rodriguez contacted Captain Mitchell to coordinate the second evacuation run. 4 more soldiers needed immediate medical attention, and they were located in 2 different areas of the battlefield. This would require multiple landings under fire, significantly increasing the exposure time and risk to the helicopter crew. Morrison checked his medical supplies and confirmed that he had enough equipment to treat several casualties simultaneously. However, the helicopter's cargo capacity was limited, and he would need to make difficult triage decisions about which soldiers to evacuate first based on the severity of their injuries. Chen calculated fuel consumption for the remaining missions and determined that they could complete 3 more round trips before reaching minimum fuel reserves. However, the damaged tail rotor was consuming more power than normal, which could reduce their operational time and force an early return to base. The radio brought more bad news from the battlefield. Enemy reinforcements had arrived and were joining the assault on the trapped American positions. The odds against the soldiers were becoming increasingly overwhelming, and their defensive positions were being systematically destroyed by enemy fire. Walsh observed enemy movement through binoculars and noted that additional weapons positions had been established since their first rescue mission. The enemy had learned from the initial helicopter assault and was better prepared to counter subsequent rescue attempts. Anti-aircraft weapons might now be present in the area. Rodriguez started the helicopter engines despite the obvious risks and mechanical problems. The tail rotor vibration was noticeably worse than before, and several warning lights remained illuminated on the instrument panel. The aircraft was operating well beyond normal safety limits, but it was still their only option for saving the trapped soldiers. Colonel Harrison watched grimly as the damaged helicopter lifted off for its second rescue mission. She had made the decision to allow the operation to continue, knowing that she was risking the lives of Rodriguez's crew to save the trapped soldiers. The weight of command had never felt heavier as she watched the aircraft disappear toward the battlefield. Chen monitored radio traffic as they approached the combat zone, noting that enemy activity had increased significantly since their first mission. The enemy forces were clearly preparing for a major assault, and the window of opportunity for evacuation was closing rapidly. Speed and decisiveness would be essential for the success of the remaining rescue operations. Rodriguez approached the battlefield for the second time, noting that enemy fire was more intense and better coordinated than during the first rescue mission. The enemy fighters had used the intervening time to improve their positions and coordinate their defensive plan. Tracer fire filled the air like a deadly light show, and the sound of explosions echoed across the valley. Chen spotted the location of the next wounded soldiers through binoculars, while Rodriguez maneuvered the helicopter through increasingly heavy enemy fire. 2 casualties were located near the main group of trapped soldiers, while 2 more were isolated in a separate position about 300 meters away. This would require 2 separate landing attempts under fire. Walsh engaged enemy positions with suppressing fire as soon as they entered the valley, trying to keep the enemy gunners' heads down long enough for the helicopter to reach the first landing site. His accurate machine gun bursts forced several enemy fighters to take cover, but return fire was immediate and intense. Bullet holes appeared in the helicopter's fuselage within seconds of entering the combat zone. The damaged tail rotor was making the helicopter much harder to control under these conditions. Rodriguez had to constantly adjust his flying to compensate for the mechanical problems, while simultaneously avoiding enemy fire and searching for landing sites. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable, requiring all of his skill and experience to maintain control. Morrison prepared to treat multiple casualties as they approached the first group of wounded soldiers. He could see through the helicopter windows that the soldiers below were in desperate condition, with several lying motionless and others attempting to provide first aid with limited supplies. The sight reinforced his determination to complete the rescue mission, regardless of the personal risks. Rodriguez brought the helicopter down in another controlled crash landing near the first group of wounded soldiers. The impact was even harder than the first landing due to the tail rotor problems, and warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Chen reported multiple system malfunctions, but the aircraft was still operational enough to continue the mission. 4 soldiers immediately rushed toward the helicopter, carrying 2 wounded comrades on improvised stretchers. The casualties were Corporal David Kim, who had been shot in the abdomen, and Private First Class Maria Santos, who had suffered severe leg injuries from an explosion. Both were conscious but clearly in serious condition. Walsh provided covering fire while the wounded soldiers were loaded, but enemy fire was more accurate and sustained than during the first rescue. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded close enough to shower the helicopter with debris, and machine gun bullets struck the aircraft's armor plating with metallic impacts that rang through the cabin. Morrison worked quickly to stabilize both casualties, while enemy fire continued around them. Kim was bleeding internally and needed immediate surgery, while Santos had compound fractures that required careful handling to prevent further damage. Both soldiers were conscious enough to understand the danger everyone was facing to save their lives. Chen monitored the helicopter's systems while Rodriguez prepared for takeoff, noting that hydraulic pressure was dropping and engine temperatures were rising beyond normal limits. The aircraft was suffering cumulative damage from enemy fire and mechanical stress that was pushing it toward complete failure. Rodriguez lifted the helicopter off the ground just as an RPG round exploded where they had been sitting moments before. The blast wave rocked the aircraft and caused additional damage to the already compromised tail rotor. The helicopter was becoming increasingly difficult to control, requiring constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. As they climbed out of the valley with the two wounded soldiers, Walsh reported that the tail rotor damage had worsened significantly. Several rotor blades were now visibly damaged, and the control system was showing signs of imminent failure. They might have enough time to reach base and return for one more mission, but that would be pushing their luck beyond reasonable limits. Morrison worked on both casualties during the flight back to base, monitoring their vital signs and providing emergency medical treatment. Kim's condition was deteriorating due to internal bleeding, while Santos was going into shock from blood loss and pain. Both soldiers needed surgery within the next hour to survive. Chen calculated their remaining fuel and operational time, determining that they could complete one more round trip to the battlefield before reaching minimum reserves. However, the mechanical problems were consuming more fuel than expected, and the damaged systems were reducing the helicopter's overall efficiency and performance. Rodriguez pushed the failing helicopter to its maximum speed while trying to minimize stress on the damaged tail rotor. The aircraft was vibrating badly and making ominous mechanical noises that suggested imminent failure. Every minute of flight time was borrowed time that could end in catastrophic mechanical failure. As they approached the base, Morrison reported that both casualties were stable but critical. The rapid evacuation had probably saved their lives, but both would require extensive surgery and recovery time. The medical team was standing by to receive them and begin immediate treatment. Rodriguez landed at the base medical facility for the second time, and the ground crew immediately began refueling, while Morrison transferred the wounded soldiers to the surgical teams. The helicopter's condition had deteriorated dramatically, with multiple bullet holes, damaged systems, and obvious structural stress from the combat operations. Colonel Harrison was waiting again, but her expression had changed from anger to grim determination. She had been monitoring radio traffic from the battlefield and knew that the situation was becoming desperate. Enemy forces were preparing for their final assault, and conventional air support was still 15 minutes away. Chen completed another inspection of the helicopter and reported that the aircraft was barely airworthy. The tail rotor was operating well outside safety parameters, multiple systems were malfunctioning, and the fuselage showed stress fractures from the hard landings. One more mission would almost certainly result in mechanical failure. Walsh replenished his ammunition, while noting that several of the helicopter's defensive systems had been damaged by enemy fire. The door guns were still operational, but the aircraft's ability to protect itself was significantly reduced. They would be flying a crippled aircraft into an increasingly dangerous combat zone. Rodriguez faced the most difficult decision of the entire operation. The helicopter was on the verge of mechanical failure. His crew was exhausted from the stress of combat operations, and the enemy was better prepared than ever to counter their rescue attempts. But 147 soldiers were still trapped, and conventional rescue forces had not yet arrived. Morrison checked his medical supplies and realized that he had used most of his trauma equipment on the previous casualties. He would have limited ability to treat additional wounded soldiers, though he could still provide basic first aid and stabilization during transport to the base medical facility. The radio brought increasingly desperate calls from Captain Mitchell, reporting that enemy forces were moving into assault positions and would attack within the next 30 minutes. His soldiers were nearly out of ammunition, and several more had been wounded by the intensifying enemy fire. Time was running out for any rescue attempts. Chen monitored weather conditions and noted that afternoon winds were becoming stronger and more unpredictable. Combined with the helicopter's mechanical problems, the deteriorating weather would make flying even more dangerous and difficult. The operational window was closing from multiple directions. Rodriguez knew that this would likely be their final rescue mission, either because the helicopter would fail mechanically or because the enemy assault would overrun the trapped soldiers. Whatever they accomplished in the next hour would determine how many American soldiers survived the day. Rodriguez made the decision to attempt one final rescue mission, despite the helicopter's critical mechanical condition and the overwhelming odds against success. He knew the aircraft might not survive another trip to the battlefield, but 147 soldiers were still trapped and facing imminent annihilation. The moral weight of abandoning fellow soldiers outweighed any concerns about personal survival. Colonel Harrison made a final attempt to convince Rodriguez to abort the mission, pointing out that losing his crew would not help the trapped soldiers and would only add to the casualty count. However, she could see the determination in his eyes and knew that nothing would dissuade him from attempting to save as many lives as possible. Chen volunteered to stay with the mission despite knowing that the helicopter's mechanical failures made survival unlikely. As co-pilot, her skills would be essential for managing the aircraft's failing systems while Rodriguez focused on flying. She accepted the risk because abandoning fellow soldiers was not an option she could live with. Walsh checked his ammunition one final time and prepared for what would likely be the most dangerous mission of his military career. The helicopter's defensive capabilities were severely reduced, and the enemy was better prepared than ever to counter their rescue attempts, but he had served with many of the trapped soldiers and would not abandon them when they needed help most. Morrison organized his remaining medical supplies, knowing that he had limited equipment left for treating casualties. However, his basic first aid skills could still mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers during the flight back to base. His medical oath compelled him to continue the mission regardless of the personal risks. Rodriguez started the damaged helicopter for what everyone knew might be its final flight. The tail rotor vibration was severe enough to shake the entire aircraft, and multiple warning systems indicated imminent mechanical failure. The engines were running hot, hydraulic pressure was marginal, and electrical systems were malfunctioning intermittently. As they lifted off from the base, Chen monitored radio traffic from the battlefield and heard Captain Mitchell's increasingly desperate calls for help. Enemy forces had begun their final assault, and his soldiers were being overrun position by position. Several more casualties had been reported, and ammunition was completely exhausted in some sectors. The flight to the battlefield took longer than previous missions due to the helicopter's reduced performance and the need to avoid stressing the damaged systems. Rodriguez had to fly more cautiously to prevent complete mechanical failure, but time was working against the trapped soldiers with each passing minute. Walsh observed the battlefield through binoculars as they approached and saw that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. Enemy forces were advancing across the valley floor, using covering fire to move closer to the American positions. Several defensive positions had been overrun, and the remaining soldiers were concentrated in an increasingly small area. Rodriguez realized that conventional landing procedures would be impossible due to the enemy assault in progress. The only option was to hover over the trapped soldiers and extract them using rope lines, a procedure that would expose the helicopter to sustained enemy fire for an extended period while operating with damaged flight controls. Chen coordinated with Captain Mitchell to identify the soldiers who needed immediate evacuation, prioritizing the wounded and those in the most exposed positions. Mitchell reported that 12 soldiers were wounded and unable to move under their own power, while the rest could potentially climb rope lines if the helicopter could maintain a stable hover. Morrison prepared rope extraction equipment while Rodriguez maneuvered the failing helicopter into position over the trapped soldiers. The aircraft was vibrating so badly that it was difficult to maintain precise control, and the damaged tail rotor made hovering extremely challenging under the best conditions. Enemy fire concentrated on the helicopter as soon as it appeared over the battlefield, with every available weapon targeting the aircraft. Tracer rounds filled the air around them, and RPG rounds exploded close enough to rock the helicopter with their blast waves. Walsh returned fire with the door guns, but the aircraft's movement made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Rodriguez struggled to maintain a stable hover, while soldiers below attached themselves to rope lines and began climbing toward the helicopter. The damaged flight controls made it nearly impossible to hold position, and enemy fire was causing additional damage to critical systems. Warning lights flashed continuously across the instrument panel. Chen counted soldiers as they climbed aboard the helicopter, keeping track of weight and balance while monitoring the aircraft's failing systems. The helicopter was operating well beyond its design limits, carrying more weight than recommended while dealing with severe mechanical problems and combat damage. Morrison helped wounded soldiers into the aircraft while providing basic medical care for the most seriously injured. Several casualties were unconscious and required careful handling, while others were barely able to climb the rope lines due to their injuries. Every second of delay increased the risk of mechanical failure or enemy fire bringing down the helicopter. Walsh continued engaging enemy positions, but his ammunition was running low, and the helicopter's movement made precision fire nearly impossible. Enemy fighters were closing in on the American positions from multiple directions, and it was clear that this would be the final opportunity for evacuation before the position was completely overrun. Rodriguez felt the helicopter shudder as the tail rotor finally began to fail completely, making it increasingly difficult to control the aircraft's movement. He knew they had only minutes before the mechanical failure would force them to land, or crash, potentially trapping them on the battlefield with the soldiers they were trying to rescue. Captain Mitchell made the difficult decision to send only the wounded soldiers and essential personnel on the helicopter, knowing that the aircraft could not carry everyone and might not survive the return flight. He ordered the remaining healthy soldiers to attempt a fighting withdrawal to a secondary position, where they might be able to hold out until conventional air support arrived. Chen reported that they had loaded 32 soldiers, including all of the seriously wounded, but that the helicopter was now severely overloaded and barely capable of flight. The combination of excessive weight, mechanical damage, and ongoing enemy fire created conditions that no training manual had ever addressed. Rodriguez began the most challenging flight of his career, trying to get the overloaded and damaged helicopter airborne while enemy fire continued to strike the aircraft. The tail rotor was failing rapidly, making it nearly impossible to control the helicopter's direction and altitude simultaneously. As they climbed out of the valley, Walsh reported that conventional air support had finally arrived on station. Fighter jets were beginning to engage enemy positions, and attack helicopters were moving in to provide close air support for the remaining trapped soldiers. The long-awaited rescue forces were finally in position to complete the evacuation. Morrison worked frantically to stabilize the most seriously wounded soldiers during the flight back to base, knowing that several would not survive without immediate surgery. The helicopter's violent movement due to the mechanical problems made medical treatment nearly impossible, but he continued providing what care he could. Rodriguez coaxed the failing helicopter back to base through sheer determination and flying skill, landing just as the tail rotor finally seized completely. The aircraft would never fly again, but they had successfully evacuated the most critically wounded soldiers and proved that the rescue mission was possible. Colonel Harrison was waiting at the landing pad with the full medical team, her expression showing relief that Rodriguez and his crew had survived their unauthorized mission. The subsequent investigation and disciplinary proceedings would be handled later. For now, the focus was on treating the wounded soldiers and coordinating the conventional rescue of the remaining troops. The final count showed that Rodriguez and his crew had evacuated 35 soldiers during their 3 rescue missions, including all of the critically wounded who would have died without immediate medical attention. The remaining 115 soldiers were successfully extracted by conventional forces after air support had neutralized the enemy positions. Rodriguez faced court-martial proceedings for disobeying direct orders, but the charges were eventually dropped due to the extraordinary circumstances and the lives saved by his actions. He received both official commendation for heroism and unofficial censure for violating military protocol, reflecting the complex nature of his decision to prioritize saving lives over following orders. The rescue operation became a case study in military leadership schools, illustrating the difficult balance between military discipline and moral obligation to fellow soldiers. Rodriguez's decision to defy orders in order to save lives sparked debates about when individual conscience should override institutional authority in life-or-death situations.